Boa tarde, pessoal. Meu nome é Rafael Silva. Hoje eu tenho o prazer de receber o professor James Porter aqui conosco. Welcome, Jim. It is a great honor to have you here in my YouTube channel for this interview. I'm sure our public is very excited with your presence here today. I'll present you very briefly and then we start our chat. Thank you very much for being here. And I thank also the public who will watch this interview now or in the future, because it will be here hosted in my YouTube channel. James Porter is the Irving Stone Professor in Literature and Chair in the Department of Rhetoric. His teaching and research has followed a few different trajectories. One is a study of Nietzsche's thought, early and late, Nietzsche and the Philology of the Future, which is this book here. A very important book for studies on Nietzsche and also for everyone who is interested in the practice of modern philology. He also has The Invention of Dionysus, an essay on the birth of tragedy. Another of these fields which are studied by Professor Porter are the models of aesthetic sensation, perception, and experience in ancient Greece and Rome, which he explored in the origins of aesthetic thought in ancient Greece, matter, sensation, and experience, and also in the continuation of this study in the book, The Sublime in Antiquity. His most recent book is Homer, the Very Idea, which will be the main theme of our conversation today, in which he captures some of his interest in classical reception studies, but much more than that, the idea of Homer in antiquity, in modernity, the Homeric poems, the way they were composed, transmitted, and so on. James Porter has been co-editing a series called Classical Presences with Oxford University Press since 2005. And the goal of this work is precisely to promote classical studies. So thank you very much for receiving this invitation and being here, Jim. It's a great honor for us.
Thanks. Thank you. It's good to meet you finally in person.
Wow, that's great. I read your most recent book with a great pleasure, and I think it is a nice idea to discuss some of its points here, to present them to the Brazilian audience. And first of all, I would like to ask you about the way you, Jim, see the study of classics as something between the past, classical past, and the present, and how this dialogue works in your own way of dealing with these materials, as for example, Homeric poetry and other materials that come from antiquity.
Okay, thank you. Well, thanks again for the invitation, and I'll try to answer questions as best I can. The relationship of the past and the present, I think, is basic to whatever we do. Somehow, working in classics has given me a sense of historical depth that I might have missed had I gone into, say, modern German philosophy or literature. It's impossible to work in one dimension, that of the present. So the question then is, how do we connect up with the past, or how does it connect up with us? And some of the work that I've done has to do with what is called reception studies. I think the term is a bit of a misnomer, because in many ways the past produces us and we produce the past. We don't simply receive it passively. So I've been interested in that dynamic. Also interested in the basic question, I suppose. If you're a classicist, then the first question you should ask is, why are you still interested in the past? I ask my students, why do you care about Nietzsche, for instance? And I consider Nietzsche a past figure today. He's just, this old, white, dusty German philosopher who speaks a strange language. What is the relevance? Usually the relevance is not just simply a compulsion, but also a fascination. Then we have to ask the question, what's the source of that fascination? So in the case of Homer's a good example, a good case study of that type of fascination, because he's still with us because of that strong interest that we have, which we have a need to examine before we actually touch the text at all. And that's at that level, that's where I've been trying to intervene in the study of long gone past figures. I could say more about that, but let's just save that for now and then go on.
Well, that's great. And I think maybe Nietzsche has played an important role in your own development of this idea, as he was like a classicist, but a very critical one at that, in understanding the way present models the past and uses the past for present purposes. And Nietzsche has also a work in Homer which seems to influence the title of this book, Homer, the Very Idea. Yeah. And I'd like to hear a little bit more about that, the title of the book and the way Nietzsche and other contemporary readers of Homer help you understand the idea of Homer.
Right, great. So, yes, Nietzsche was also interested in exploring contemporary in his time or modern attractions to the past, but also what he called misreadings of the past. Not that he felt that he had a better idea of what happened in the past, but basically he treated the past as something like a symptom of a present situation of some sort. And so these symptomatic readings are very important for Nietzsche. He uses the study of antiquity as a index of the contemporary moment. What does antiquity do for us in the modern present? It tends to create ideals. It tends to become a kind of way of explaining our own situation in time. It's a way of sometimes making the present feel like it's surpassed the past. At other times, he shows that, in fact, we haven't actually surpassed the past because we don't really understand what the past is. So he brings out one further point, which is one that we underplay whenever we assume that the past is something that can be taken for granted. He uses the word untimely. The past, classical past for him is an untimely undertaking. It puts us in a kind of uncomfortable position between being here and being somewhere else. And the very presence of the past can be a disturbance in the present and not just simply, a way of supporting and grounding contemporary ideologies, thinking about, ourselves as post-Enlightenment creatures, etc., who have gone beyond the past or can understand it in a certain way. So by focusing on the levels of discomfort that holding an object from the past in your hands does, he's able to use it as a kind of critical weapon for diagnosing contemporary cultural understandings, prejudices. So just a word about that. I don't know if anyone's ever held an antique object in their hands, like a papyrus or a piece of pottery, or it just stood in front of a statue from the past. And then when you do that, you have to ask, what is going on in this collision of time zones between past and present? There's something immensely exciting, but also disturbing about this proximity of the past and the present. Where do we locate ourselves? Are we standing in the present looking at the past, or is the past in our own world sort of jutting out into our world and disturbing us? And Nietzsche's interested in that undecidable equation between the balance or imbalance between these two pressures. So I've worked on ancient papyri, and I've felt this kind of almost out-of-body experience, because you don't know exactly, you're seeing something that is palpable, real, also somewhat illegible, And that's some of the interesting, those are the factors that make the past interesting. One more point about the papyri. So the papyri that I'm talking about come from Herculaneum. They stem from the writings of Philodemus on ancient criticism, literary criticism. And those are a very good example of the way in which the past always can surprise us and disappoint us. When they were first found in the late 18th century, discoverers were hoping to light upon new papyri, new texts of Sappho or Sophocles. And instead what they got, well, first of all, what they got were these pieces of charcoal that they threw away thinking they were charcoal, and turned out to be they were instead carbonized pieces of papyri. Then they found a way to unfold them, and when they did, lo and behold, what they found was this crabby, polemical author from the first century BC who had a great disdain for most of his predecessors. He was an Epicurean of some sort, not Sophocles, not Sappho, but somebody who was a little bit rebarbative. And that's important too. We have to keep in mind, I think, that the past has a potential to surprise us and to disturb us. And it turns out that, in fact, he's a precious witness to ancient literary criticism that we hear about nowhere else. So there were some very good byproducts of our discovery, random discovery of the papyrus, which then required us to reconfigure our sense of the whole field of ancient literary criticism. At least it did that for me. So back to Homer, the very idea. So the notion that Homer was not a real person, but was rather a kind of a myth of some sort that was produced in antiquity, or if you like, an idea, was something that was said by Nietzsche in his inaugural speech from 1869, when at the age of 23, he stepped into the chair of Greek studies at Basel and produced a commentary on the state of classical scholarship at the time. It was a very radical statement. It was called Homer's Personality, Persönlichkeit, and later it got a different name, which he published in a kind of vanity edition of a few hundred copies. When he was done with the talk, which essentially went back to the beginnings of modern philology and Friedrich August Wolff, and went up to the present state of Homeric studies, he left his audience in such great despair and puzzlement that they laughed at him, he felt, when he walked away. He was always the misunderstood prophet of doom and, the prophet of misunderstanding, perhaps, even including himself. He always writes at the end of reflexive statements, "Have I been understood?" knowing full well that he hasn't been fully understood. So in that amazing short talk, he makes a couple of points. One is that, or he raises the question, was Homer a concept that was made out of a person, or was he a person that was made out of a concept, Begriff? And that's the source of my notion of the idea. It turns out that he was in fact preempted by Vico, who had used very much the same language in his study on Homer from 1730 in the New Science, one of the fifth chapter, I think it's called, The Discovery of Homer, where he puts the point, he doesn't even ask the question, that Homer was the idea produced by the Greek people and wasn't actually a person. This marks it has been used as a kind of index of contemporary modern philology, that it finally came to terms with the fact that it knows very little about the past, and the past is in many ways a fabrication. So there's a kind of skepticism that underlies philology. If you think about Wolff himself, he made contemporary philology in Germany in 1795 with a study on Homer, which was followed by an edition. It was called a Prolegomena to Homer, in which he proved that there was no way of actually establishing the text of Homer, because it had gone through so many transformations. He never gave up entirely on the idea that there was a Homer, that there was a core of Homeric poetry, but this rankled all the intellectual circles at the time. There are stories that Goethe would stand behind a curtain listening to Woolf's lectures, and then he would write terrifying poems or terrified poems about how he and Schiller would do the same, had destroyed their precious ideal of Homer. So philology has at its core a kind of destructive, skeptical element, and Nietzsche takes that to a radical extreme by admitting this from the beginning, and in this case by leaving open the very question: was Homer a person, or was he an idea? Was it a person that was turned into an idea because we can't get back to the person? Or was he an idea that was made into a person, embodied, given structure, given form, given even images? So that was certainly behind my own impression, my own study of Homer, which was really an attempt to do a little bit more. I'll just say a few more words about that. A little bit more than just simply celebrate the modern or repeat the modern invention of Homer, basically, by indicating that that this doubt and skepticism about the past actually existed long before Wolf, long before Vico. There were suspicions among the ancients that they could not pin down the foundations of their own Bible, which was the Homeric text, the Iliad and the Odyssey. They couldn't explain them, and they had a sense that something was amiss here, that something was wrong, and Homer seemed to be too good to be true. And so though they never said it out loud, or maybe in a few cases hinted at it, there was a suspicion all the way through that Homer was less than he was made out to be, that Homer may not have actually existed. So this kind of suspicion towards the past is not ours alone. We're not the first. We shouldn't be triumphant about this, our ability to see through the haze of the past, but actually to allow antiquity room for maneuver and room for doubts of its own. So that was certainly one of my, one of the intentions in writing that book, and one of the discoveries I would say as I was working on it, because I didn't know myself how far this would take me, and it turned out that there are doubts that go pretty much all the way down, including with Homer himself, in his own poetry. So myth upon myth upon myth produces this magnificent monument of Homer that had to be fashioned and built, and not just simply discovered in its monumentality. It had to be created as a cultural object of some sort. So Homer then becomes more than simply an idea, but an idea around which cultural production takes place, or cultural destruction in the case of, say, Wolf and Nietzsche, and even in the Antiquity as well. Homer was both lifted up, divinized, and he was also brought down to the level of a mere mortal. And it's that kind of imbalance that precisely indicates a kind of unease with the question of who Homer was and why does it matter to us. So we're not quite yet alone in that project.
Well, that's fantastic, Jim. And I like this mention you made to Wolf's work, because it seems to me that it is no coincidence that Friedrich August Wolf is the one responsible for writing maybe the first modern account on the problems of the Homeric text and our capacity to come back to the original Homer. Mm-hmm. But also the one responsible for writing his Darstellung der Altertumswissenschaft, the presentation of the science of antiquity, and the way he tries to combine the skeptical attitude towards the ancient materials, but at the same time putting the study of the past into national purposes or national educational purposes. And I think Homer comes to represent also to the modern world an idea of science in one hand, but also of education and model attitudes in another. And in some way, we can retrace the same attitude to the past, but I think Wolf is a point of changing in this history. And it always is very, I'm always impressed by this centrality of Homer throughout the classical studies, the history of classical studies since antiquity.
Yes. And it is absolutely right. You could write an entire history of classical discipline by focusing on just the imaginary or real substance of Homer. The transmission of the text, philology, was built around the understanding Homeric language, which began already. He was already out of date by the 5th century, and we have examples or knowledge of these glossographic texts, the glossae, which were basically ways to cheat, kind of vocabulary index of Homer that students had to learn so that they could understand this strange creature. And it was that both the difference that he represented from the past, his unintelligibility, which made him almost, and his inaccessibility, which contributed to his aura, and around which then, as I said, cultural production could take place, and yes, even ideological constructions as well. The Greeks became Greeks thanks to their readings of Homer. They transformed the whole story of the attack on Troy into a kind of emblem of Greece versus Persia after 480 BC, when Greeks became Greek, as it were. Until then, even Thucydides says there was no one word for the Greeks. There were different tribes, different names, the Achaeans, the Mycenaeans, etc., the Myrmidons, but they were not, Hellenes was just simply one of the many tribes. And it's only later that you could say the idea of Greece is born. You're absolutely right about Wolf representing a step towards science and positivism, but science also requires, or if you like, historicism, but science also seems to be moved not just by an ideal of arriving at truth, but also some sort of moral or educational pedagogical purpose, a humanistic one. It needs, at least in Wolf's time, maybe today that's no longer the case, but in his time, science had to rest on the foundations which were contrary to its own instincts. To be positivistic meant undermining the foundations of the humanistic message of Homer, and yet to valorize the scientific enterprise, a humanistic understanding of Homer's value had to be attached to Homer. So you see these strands pulling apart and straining, and this kind of conflict runs all through the 19th century, maybe up until the early 20th century, at which point things change, and I'm not quite sure how to characterize that change. But we no longer have that kind of, I suppose you could say that Milman Parry, the author of Oral Theory, did some of the same kind of damage to Homer as Wolf did, made Homer look like he was just a mechanical robot that was putting together epithets and, determined by meter and not by, and not necessarily even himself understanding the language that he inherited. It's a wonderful paradox. There's one other factor that's very important, just to piggyback on what you said, Raphael, which is that just as the Greeks created a notion of Hellenicity, of Greekness, and of made Homer into the first patriot of the Greeks, so too Wolf did something similar for the Germans or for Europe. And one of the ways in which he did that was through a kind of racialization effect that took off by the time of Schliemann, and then eventually under the fascists, Homer became a kind of proto-fascistic, icon. In Woolf's time, he made it very clear. He made this drastic, and I would say mistake, to cordon off the Near East as not eligible for study by classics. Classics had to be classical, and classical meant Athenocentric, Helleноcentric, okay, maybe some Roman poetry as well, insofar as it imitated Greece, but it could not cover the Semitic lands. And he was very clear about this, that not just Mesopotamia, and I don't think he cared much about it, but especially the Jewish traditions of the Bible had to be severed from the tradition of classics. Up until that time, they were thought together. I think that the Renaissance scholars, many of them, were much more advanced than we are because they thought of these as going hand in hand. Christian Hebraists would study Hebrew, and they also commented on Homer or on classical texts. With Woolf, that disciplinary distinction was enforced, and unfortunately, anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism was bound up with the formation of classics, and it runs all the way through into the present. That's been one of that was a revelation for me when I was working on that Nietzsche book as well, in the final chapter, where it became very clear that Nietzsche who sometimes tarred with the brush of being an anti-Semite, was in fact against that trend. And he was very aware that the Germans were using Greece as a way of conscripting Greece into an image of what Germany meant in the modernity. So there's a title by a book by Butler called The Tyranny of Greece Over Germany, and it really should be called The Tyranny of Germany Over Greece. But the Germans did make Greeks into something like their mirror image in some ways, a little bit more primitive, but also attributing to them all the traits that come with being a contemporary modern European and German: rationality, clear-headedness, cheerfulness of a certain sort, honesty. And of course, none of these are entirely true of what ancient Greeks were. A good example, one that comes to mind, is that there was they took their cues perhaps from what the Greeks did themselves, which was to idealize their own physical bodies. And we see that in classical statuary. And at one point, some modern 1950s or 60s anthropologist, I believe he was, it may have been Hungarian, pointed out that the Greeks, in fact, were short, stubby, probably closer looking to Socrates than they were to the statues we find in the Parthenon. And so this idealization, this fetish around a certain kind of ethnic purity and beauty and nobility was one that, again, was already prepared. The way was prepared for by the Greeks themselves, the ancients themselves, who must have looked at the statues and felt rather inferior to them. Maybe they felt that way about their gods, I don't know. But modernity did turn Greece into a kind of myth of the modern age. Yeah. And Woolf is important to that movement. Oh, I don't hear you. I think you turned off your... Okay.
Yes, sorry. And this modern fabrication of a German Greece is very interesting to understand, because it has side effects that affect us even today. Maybe we can point like Winkelmann as one of the main or the first ones to begin this idealizing of the Greeks as a model for the Germans. But Wolf continued the work, and it, I think, one of the apex of this movement, and also of the tension between historicism and humanism, goes up to Werner Jaeger, who in the preface of his Paideia, in the German edition, treats very, very tensely this problem of developing educational models for the present and studying the past. for its own sake. And maybe the Second World War is the watershed of these tensions, at least in which Germany is concerned. But I would like to drive the attention of our public to some of the points of your book, because there you deal with this idea of Homer. So not specifically the poems, the Homeric poems in themselves, but you deal with this problem as well. And one of the things I found very interesting in your approach is that you suggest the symbolic value of the end of the Bronze Age as kept in the Homeric poems themselves as a kind of traumatic memory. Well, how to say, like among the Greeks themselves and preserved in these poems. And I'd like to hear something more about this idea of a traumatic memory collectively shared.
Okay, sure. First, just a comment on Jaeger. For those who read German, you want to read the first volume in the first edition, which he wrote in, I think, 33 before he emigrated to the US. And then he reprinted it in the early 40s with, you could call a sanitized version, where he removed all the hidden, not so hidden, traces of Nazism that were built into his picture of the Greeks. And he made himself much more acceptable as a scholar when he finally arrived in the US and ended up at Harvard. So you need to read the first, that's true of only the first volume. So yes, the fascinating thing about Homer, the question is, why Homer now? Obviously, that's Nietzsche's question. What do we care? Why is it important to us? And then for the Greeks themselves, why Homer and why not some other poet? What was it that made Homer into such an interesting collecting point of collective fantasies and collective, well, more than fantasies? And so my hypothesis is that that Homer would not have been Homer if it weren't for his connection to Troy. Now it was precisely because he marked he marked history and the turning point in history, and commemorated it in his poems, that he became such an important figure for the Greeks who were trying to understand their own past. Quick word about Troy. The fall of Troy was considered in later thinking to be the beginning of secular, if you like, secular history, of non-mythical history. So you find Democritus dating his works X number of years or generations after the fall of Troy. And he's not alone. We find that in the Parian Marble and other places too. They knew roughly that the dates of the fall of Troy, sometime around 1170 or so for them, 1200 or so, early 1200s for us. And so this idea that a rupture occurs at the moment that Troy, this magnificent memory of what? Of a palace culture from the Bronze Age that would have been visible to the Greeks living in 700 or 900 as ruins, as runes, and as ruins with images that suggested that they were put together by cyclopes, by cyclopses, not by human hands. The cyclopean structures, what we call that today, these huge stones, where did all this come from? And very little of it was left. Now, I may be over dramatizing it, but I don't think too much. It's known that Troy became a sacral site where sacrifices and rituals were performed after Troy had fallen. It was made into a kind of tourist destination of some sort with sacral qualities. And so Homer represents a further sacralization, or maybe he's the cause of that sacralization, because, all right, let's talk about that. We have the idea of Homer. What about the idea of Troy? Was there such a thing as Troy? Did it ever actually happen? And there were disputes about that as well. And there are still today. There's no actual proof that what is narrated by Homer took place in the past at all. That's a fairly disturbing thought. Schliemann did everything he could to try to prove it wrong. And that's what drove him to dig at Troy and probably destroy half the evidence that he was worming his way through. But nonetheless, there's no clear consensus that Troy actually underwent a kind of catastrophic destruction due to military invasions. The thought is probably that something far worse happened, and that was a massive destruction, a system collapse all over the Mycenaean. And this is worse because it's even more unfathomable, caused by fires, by volcanic storms, by firestorms, by earthquakes. And so there's no clear understanding even now of what it was that caused all the Mycenaean centers, palaces to collapse around in the same century or two. Troy was one of them, but also in Egypt, in the Far East, in the Near East, and in other parts of Asia Minor. So what we have here then is, like you say, a traumatic event that is dimly recalled and maybe more threatening precisely because we cannot pin down the facts. And so the imagination plays with catastrophe and magnifies it to some degree, and also placates it, tries to paper it over, tries to invent some noble explanation for something which may have had nothing to do with human causes at all. So there's a kind of, I think, a residual puzzlement that's carried by the idea of Troy. And this is maybe contributed to by the mysteriousness, maybe it's an effect of that, mysteriousness of Homer, its author, the one author that actually talks about the imminent destruction of Troy. And one more point about that is that Homer was treated as himself a kind of archaeological site when he went through a kind of collapse the same way that Troy did. It's said in the Pisistratean tradition that Homer's poems were destroyed by fire, by earthquake, by water, by flooding, and so on, that they went through the same kind of damage that Troy had gone through. And then somehow the fragments survived. Well, if that's not an emblem of an unconscious awareness that some traumatic catastrophe happened in the past, and it happened both to Troy and to Homer, and their fates were linked together indelibly. So anyway, that gives grounds for suspicion that there's some deeper connection going on, probably working at under the level of consciousness that makes these two glorious catastrophes somehow linked in their imaginary re-fulfillment as they're re-embodied. One last point about the Homer, which is unbelievably clever about the Homeric poems. I say Homer, but we should say the tradition that produced Homer over centuries and centuries, probably before Troy fell, before the Mycenaean, there were epics of this sort, and we have artwork to show that, but also especially around Troy, once the ruins became visible but puzzlingly fragmented. And that is that Homer, it's well known, I think it's Monroe's Law, but I may be wrong, that what happens in the Iliad is not told in the Odyssey, and vice versa. It's like they have territorial rights. You talk about these events and I'll talk about these. And we don't know if that was two different traditions that somehow collaboratively did this, but they produced a gap between the two epics. Where was that gap? It was in the destruction of Troy itself. That is never narrated, described in either poem. It's hinted at, it's foreshadowed in the Iliad, it's backshadowed in the Odyssey, it causes tears to Odysseus whenever he thinks back, but we never actually see the destruction happen. So this adds one more element of, of intrigue to the whole question of Homer and Troy, which is that we are left to the devices of our imagination to fill in that gap. And maybe it's precisely the absence of the fall of Troy that makes it that much more present for us, when it's the only thing that we actually think about, but it's the one thing that we can't see. And by the way, why was Homer blind? Well, he didn't see it either. So, we are stuck in this incredible double bind of knowing that something took place, but we can't actually lay eyes on it. And we can say this is a magnificent literary coup, or we can say that it's somehow a psychological symptom of something that is so terrifying that it can't actually be made visible at all for us. Or maybe it's just more interesting for us not to see it and just to imagine it, but somehow this is at play. So Homer, Troy become a symptom of something in the past that later gets addressed in the present and successive presents in different ways. The gap is filled in different ways. And that's what makes it possible, even up to the point of Nietzsche, to read Homer as a kind of symptom of cultural malaise or grandeur or confusion or ambivalence. Most likely ambivalence, I'd have to say, but that's my own personal take.
That's a fantastic way of conceptualizing the law of Monroe and this not superposing way of dealing with the mythic background in the Iliad as opposed to the Odyssey. Thanks for that. That's very inspiring. And one interesting fact about the problem of the supposed date of the fall of Troy and the way these Homeric poems come to be written centuries later is because the Greeks or the Mycenaeans, they stopped using writing at some point, and the transmission of these stories came through oral traditions, and at some much later point became written down and preserved, and probably according to the interests of some groups. And I would like to address this question. Why the Homeric poems would be interesting, for example, for Athens, for the Athenians, or later on for the Alexandrians, or even for the Romans?
Well, very simply, you're right about all that. Very simply, everybody wanted a piece of the past. And if possible, they want to inject themselves into the past. So there is something called each of the cities we learn later in the Hellenistic age had various text, different transmissions, slight variations tailored to those geographic locations. They were called city editions. And Athens had its own edition, which was slightly different from all the others. And there are all sorts of stories of the Pisistratean reception tradition transmission that I talked about is one of the examples where Pisistratus, an Athenian tyrant, lay hold of the Homeric heritage and brought it to Athens. And there are different figures who are thought to have done this. One, a Spartan king as well, but these were the two main ones. But it was very clear that to have a piece of the past meant appropriating the past. And the Athenian tradition was unusual because it's suspected that they injected references to Athens in their edition of Homer in order to validate their own participation in the Trojan conquest and also to validate their appropriation of Homer. Homer became essentially Athenian. By the time you get to the Alexandrian scholars, it's thought that Homer spoke Attic Greek. Why? Because Attic Greek was the dialect of Athens, and the Athenian tradition was considered the most pure, the most reliable. So Aristarchus, the great scholar from 150, was the one who made that kind of decision. So the Alexandrian scholars followed in the wake of what I named before, Athenocentrism. So, but each of the other cities did have their own versions, and we don't know much about them. We only hear, bits and pieces of them as they're being weighed against the central canonical edition that's that Aristarchus used, which he based on the Attic version. Well, it's not in Attic, but it was the he thought that Homeric Greek was a dialect of, which is Ionic, and also contains other Aeolic and other elements. He thought that that was a version of Attic, which is completely wrong, but that's okay. So I'm trying to remember. So why that interest? So everybody in the Greek world was very eager to claim a piece of that past. Homer had 7 to 15 different places of birth. So he hailed from various islands and from the mainland, and etc. And you would go to Homer's birthplace to make a kind of what would you call it? Well, to make a trek to see, it would be kind of a tourist attraction to see where Homer actually came from, and that was a way of building up the national economy, as it were, the national ideology of the local polities in the Greek world. Everybody wanted to imitate the Greek characters. Even Alexander would go to Troy and reenact certain scenes from the Iliad and sacrifice to the tomb of Achilles. By the way, there were 3 or 4 different tombs of Achilles because no one knew exactly where he was buried, if he was buried at all. And he too he thought of himself as a kind of descendant of the Greeks who'd come to Asia to conquer it, and he was carrying out the mission on a larger scale than they had. And then this continued all the way into modernity, but not without hiccups. Not everybody wanted to identify with the Greeks and with Homer. Some repugned him. Some thought that he was an inferior poet. He was, after all, archaic, primitive, and that was one of that ambivalence towards Homer being at the origins of a tradition that was so alien to us that it could be either idealized or debased, depending on how we stood towards that. And we do the same today with the way, I don't know about in Brazil, but in the US, we do much the same. Every court building in the country is made with columns that resemble those that were either at Troy or at Athens. Jefferson's architecture was built around Greek ideals and so on. But Homer is a particular issue because he brings to the forefront the ambivalence that we have towards the past. By the way, one other ambivalence that we couldn't name is that if we think about it, there's something horrific about putting at the very foot of civilization a destructive event like the capture of Troy over the confiscation of the most beautiful woman of the world, but still just a woman. There's something absurd and demeaning about the fact that we have a violent event that we call the beginning or foundation of our Western civilization. And that is something that Nietzsche was very attuned to, and that we can do a little bit better at than some of the other readers of Homer who try to humanize the battle, show that in fact to build around it a kind of redemptive reading. By the time that the end of the battle is over, Achilles and Priam make up, they break bread together, they cry together. Achilles relents, he gives back the body of Hector, and he's made human, or all too human. But of course, then Homer doesn't quite leave it that way. We know that in 4 days, Troy will be taken again. So this problem of barbarism and violence at the foot of civilization, probably nobody beyond Nietzsche, except for perhaps Adorno and Horkheimer in the Dialectic of Enlightenment, brought out that perplexity so well. Nobody besides them. I would also say perhaps there are other cases. Subtly, Eric Auerbach in his reading of the Odyssey, in Mimesis, Rachel Bespalov, a work that's not very well known, but you should read it, everybody. It's called On the Iliad, or De l'Iliade, published in 43, 2 years after Simone Weil's work on the Iliad also came out. Both of them very complex critiques of the violence, the force that produced this wonderful epic that we consider the canonical epic of the West. So that's the paradox.
Well, that's fascinating, Jim, because the way you treat these poems kind of challenges traditional approaches to Homer, because even if we are progressists or conservatists, normally we focus on the how to say it, the canonical status of Homer, the way he was conceived by, let's say, Herodotus, Thucydides, Plato, Aristotle, and so on. But at the same time, one interesting thing you show is that other people, but sometimes even the same people who canonized Homer, could be very critical about some of the features of these poems. And that's very interesting, because it is not so simple as having like a canonical work of art that's that serves national purposes or something like that. But it is about the complexities of this poem or these materials, and even the image of Homer itself.
Yes.
So that's very interesting, because Homer was like a central figure for Greek paideia, or even classical paideia. At some point in the West, he was kind of forgotten, or not forgotten, maybe the idiom, the language was forgotten, Greek itself, and it was difficult to keep understanding the Iliad or the Odyssey, even if in Byzantium people continued the studies. But at some point, when previous to the Renaissance, maybe 100 years before, people started getting in touch again, but it was quite difficult to understand why the ancients praised so much Homer, because Petrarch read it and he was like, okay, I admire it, but I can't quite understand it. And many of the modern readers of Homer demonstrate the same thing, like Julius, Kaiser Scaliger, all the participants in the Querelle des Anciens et des Modernes, even Vico and others, they were trying to grasp what was behind these poems. And can we talk a little bit about this modern reception of Homer and his poems?
So one point to add to what you just said, which is perfectly correct, is that the Renaissance received not only the canonical picture of Homer, but also the doubting Thomases from the past, who wondered, is he so canonical as he's made out to be? The idea that a single author could have ambivalence, show ambivalence to Homer. A good case in point would be Aristotle, who praises the epic form. Of course, it's not quite as perfect as tragedy, but it's the source of all tragic form. And yet he says Homer taught the poets how to lie. So so he's a liar for Homer. And that became a kind of leitmotif running all the way through the traditions of Homer, down to the second sophistic or imperial Roman prose like Dio, Lucian, and so on, who insisted that Homer was a pathological liar, that he invented things. Of course, that's what fiction is. So there was also this ambivalence about what is creative fiction, and is Homer fictional or real? It's great art, but isn't art somehow touching up reality, maybe betraying it? And the critiques that came out were stronger than Aristotle. Aristotle says, but lying is okay, they're harmless, there's nothing ethically serious about the lie. Whereas for Dio, Homer simply tells us false stories about the past. He inverts the realities. Troy wasn't taken by the Greeks. The Trojans whipped the Greeks on the battlefield, and so on. But anyway, so the Renaissance, as I said earlier about Christian Hebraists and their wide-ranging interests, they received both sides of the picture. They read Dio, they read Lucian at the same time, and all the other absurd, well, not absurd, but comical and debasing traditions about Homer and the lives at the same time that they received Homer. So they got in their hands competing images about Homer, and then they played with it one way or the other, either debate, carrying out the critiques like Scaliger does, or worshiping Homer the way some of the people in the Querelle des Anciens et des Modernes do themselves. Yeah, I think if anyone's interested, Samuel Butler has a wonderful spoof on the Homeric question. It's called The Authoress of the Odyssey, where he tells us that the actual author of the Odyssey was a woman, not Homer. She was, eventually we find out that she was the daughter of Alcinous, Nausicaa, that Odysseus fell in love with. What he really means, or behind the justification of this, is the fact that the real inspiration for Homer was the muse. And so there was a female figure that actually told Homer what to sing about, because Homer didn't know the facts. He says as much in book 2. And then there were other stories later from Antiquity where we even get this in Isocrates, stories about how Helen was one of the inspirations of Homer herself, a mythical figure who was godlike. So that kind of disturbance is blown up in an extraordinary way in Samuel Butler's hilarious spoof on contemporary classical scholarship, where he proves or demonstrates that if there's nothing that can be proven, anything can be proven. And so he's absolutely correct to say that you can't disprove my hypothesis because you can't prove yours about what Homer is. And that's just taking skepticism and turning it on its head, which is, that was itself a tradition that came up, and there was a lot of lighthearted mockery of the whole idea, the whole enterprise of recovering the past. And philology today, if it doesn't take notice of maybe its own foundations, if it can't laugh at itself, then it's tricking itself into a kind of faux seriousness about its own objectives, its ability to lay bare the past. And this is where Nietzsche's critique would come in, where he would say, let's look at the philologists. What are they trying to do? Let's diagnose them as a symptom of contemporary culture right now in 1869 or 1884, whenever it is that he brings out his Homer card, and he does it repeatedly, or his classical card, and turns on its head the contemporary views of the desires of the contemporary world to try to make sense of a past that is so difficult to do that it can't help but mirror its own anxieties or its own aspirations.
Great, Tim. We are coming to the end of this very charming conversation soon, but I'd like first to share a question that was put by one of the members of the audience. He asks if Professor Porter could comment on the difference between classical tradition and classical reception. And I would add one further point to that, maybe thinking about the difference between what is the practice of philology and what you call counter philology. I think we can put these two things side by side.
Sure. So that's a great question. It's, in one way, it's easy to answer. It marks a historical shift away from a certain view of understanding the classics as basically anything goes. So whatever was transmitted along with tradition, that became that was worthy of being explored under the auspices of traditionalism or the classical tradition. It was there's a place it's sometimes you could say that it's something like the Maxima Cloaca in Rome, the great sewer of antiquity that just simply flows through and without discrimination. that was a style of scholarship that more or less has died out, but we still find it. It's tied to a kind of antiquarianism. It's a recovery sort of mentality. Reception studies grew up in England mainly, although of course there were attempts in Germany as well to understand, to set itself off as a kind of critical approach to reception, to antiquity and to its reception or transmission, and tradition by itself. I think that's the point. Is a kind of hallowed term. It dignifies the enterprise. Reception is much more neutral, allows for more critique and for obliquity, as well as receiving something that comes transmitted to us without any discrimination, as I said. Counter-philology is a little bit different from both of those. It's a little bit hard to describe quickly. Nietzsche certainly does a kind of counter-philology, but essentially the kind of counter-philology I'm interested in is a philology that is not interested in the hallowed past. It's not interested in receiving or reception even for its own sake, but rather is working against contemporary currents in philology and trying to unsettle those assumptions that make philology seem to work without a hitch. Examples of that would be, examples of that would include the people that I named: Auerbach, Adorno, Horkheimer, Bespalov, Simone Weil. These are kind of critical approaches to the past that can't really be said to be receptions of the past. They're counter readings. They designate themselves as being opposed to contemporary, especially at that time, fascist or Nazi readings of the past. So they're turning philology into a kind of weapon, and they're foregrounding the purpose of philology in the present moment without regard to the traditional role of philology, which is that of what Pfeiffer calls philologia perennis, the idea of recovering the past in all of its purity or just receiving it as a classical tradition. It's very present-oriented, not past-oriented, and it's and interestingly, often taken up by people who don't stand within the philological tradition. They stand outside of it, and therefore they have a better sense of what it means to intervene in philology from the outside. That's a longer question, but thank you for that question about tradition and reception.
Yes. He thank you as well for the answer. And we didn't cover even 1% of everything that's in your book, your amazing book, Jim. So I invite everyone to read it. Homer, the very idea. There are plenty of very interesting comments on works of art. For example, Ingres, La Coronation d'Homère, the deification of Homer, something like that, and many other very interesting works of art. But I would like to close this interview mentioning one thing I suggested at the end of my thesis, which is called The Gospel of Homer, and which is very indebted to James Porter's insights. And at the end of it, I comment on the enigma of Homer, the enigma posed to Homer in the biographical tradition by these fishermen. And in the thesis, I depart from the culture wars in the US from the 80s to 2000, 2010 maybe. And I try to read this enigma in the light of it, almost in an allegorical fashion. And to the people who are in the audience, I read the enigma the way it is posed by this fisherman to the Homer in many of the lives of Homer. And they say, the ones we caught, they are coming back from a fishing activity. And Homer asks, what you're bringing back home? And they answer, the ones we caught, we left behind, while the ones we missed, we are carrying with us. it is a very interesting enigma. It has been like read for by Heraclitus and many other ancient commentators. But the way I read it, I suggest that that's a very interesting way of understanding the cancel culture. I mean, when we start to cancel subjects, cancel works of art, we put these things aside and we stop seeing them. But stopping seeing them is not a way of dealing with them. We are just carrying them with us. So, like, for example, works of art that deal with racial problems in a problematic way, when we put them aside and say, oh, this doesn't exist, we stop seeing this kind of problem where it could be most seen and most dealt with. So I would like to suggest that counseling is never a good way of dealing with things. We ought to deal with them properly in the plan absolutely clearly. So thank you, Jim. I don't know what you think about this allegorical reading of the enigma, but thank you for your presence here. And I thank also the audience who has accompanied us. And well, you can make your final remarks. Thank you very much.
You want me to make final remarks or not? I love the way you read the enigma, the riddle that's posed to Homer. There's one other way to understand it, which may fit into your reading. This is improvising. The way I understand the riddle is that there were no, so the answer to the riddle is lice. So what they brought with them, what they caught, they have with them. What they, or they don't have with them. What they didn't catch, they still have with them. The lice that they didn't catch. But which is kind of disgusting in some ways, and that's part of the debasing tradition of Homer. But there's another very likely way to understand that, which is that there were no lice. The riddle is precisely that there was nothing there to actually catch or to remove. And how could Homer know anyway? Because he was blind. So the Heraclitus attacks him for not being able to see what all men, just like all other human beings. So putting that into the perspective of cancel culture, I think we should be aware that sometimes cancel culture is really nothing. It's based on a nothing that's not there. It's a kind of baiting with a MacGuffin, what Hitchcock called a MacGuffin, which is baiting the audience with a weapon of mass destruction that doesn't actually exist. You know, none was found in Iraq and none is found in the cancel culture, those who are doing the canceling. So it operates by the supposition that there's something there to cancel. And it's completely insidious. And I totally love the way you read that. And I think that's a good way to conclude the discussion this morning of let's not cancel Homer. Let's not cancel the classics. And let's not even cancel those who cancel, but rather show that the emperor has no clothes.
Amazing, Jim, and thank you for complimenting the way I read it. I totally agree with you. Maybe what's behind this idea of lice is just nothing. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Raphael. It was great meeting you.
Well, amazing, and thank the public as well. I'll end up the transmission here, but the video will be hosted in my YouTube channel, so you can check it out whenever you want. Thank you, Jim. It was great.